The Ottoman Empire, 17th century, 1 million subjects, 500 years of gunpowder, military glory, the finest cuisine in the world, fabulous art, and one very unstable sultan. Ibrahim the Mad, another of history's great leaders with a not-so-great nickname. Why? Well, when your hobbies include drowning your entire harem in silk sacks, people tend to stop calling you His Majesty and start calling you Yikes. But let's rewind. Born in 1615, Ibrahim was one of the many children of Ahmed I and his wife, the mighty Cosmos Sultan. When he was just a wee babe, his father decided that having a son who looked like Ibrahim was a bad look for the empire. So little Ibrahim and his siblings were locked up in the cafes, or golden cage, for most of their childhood. While the cage was golden, it was also pretty restrictive. Ibrahim didn't see much daylight for years. He had to pee in a corner, and his only entertainment was watching the boats on the Bosphorus. Eventually, his older brother Mustafa took over, and Ibrahim lived under his thumb until 1640, when the brother died suspiciously during an imperial duck hunting expedition. Was it murder? Who knows? But suddenly Ibrahim was being dragged out of the cage and slapped with the news, "You are the new sultan." The problem was he'd spent decades locked up, so he wasn't exactly ready to rule an empire. Plus, he'd never even been outside the cage. So when his mother, the ever-pragmatic Cosmos Sultan, stepped in to run the empire for him, Ibrahim was like, "Sweet, I can get used to this," and for a while it worked. Under Cosmos' guidance, Ibrahim basically played Sultan mascot, showing up for important events, collecting extravagant gifts, and generally looking fancy. He may have technically been in charge, but everyone knew it was his mom calling the shots. And then something inside Ibrahim snapped. How do we know what was going on in his head? Well, luckily for us, historian Joseph von Hammer recorded the ramblings of one of Ibrahim's concubines, who claimed the Sultan's thoughts could be read like a book. So here's what happened. After spending 35 years in a cage, Ibrahim developed some, unique hobbies. For starters, he became obsessed with collecting fat women. Reportedly, he'd stroll through the bazaars, grab a random plump woman, and throw her into a sack. Then he'd parade her around the palace like a child might parade a puppy, judging by the weight and size of her backside. If that sounds weird, get ready for weirder. Ibrahim apparently kept prostitutes in his palace and forced his courtiers to choose between two very unpleasant options: sleep with the women or be whipped. Oh, and if you turned out to be a bad lay, Ibrahim would cut off your balls. Because nothing screams, "I am in charge," quite like castration. Apparently, he did it himself, too, because he liked to collect testicles as trophies. Ibrahim's behavior might have been more acceptable if he hadn't also murdered several thousand of his subjects. Okay, admittedly, some of them were high-ranking officials who pissed him off. But he also ordered entire communities put to death based on flimsy accusations. One time he heard someone say cucumbers in the spring would be as big as pigeons and promptly beheaded 25 people in case it was true. In fact, he built a reputation for being so volatile and unpredictable that even the vizier responsible for delivering his death sentence wouldn't accept the job unless he was given immunity from future reprisals. So how did this all end? Well, remember those 500 concubines Ibrahim kept talking about at the beginning? Yeah, him and his mom, they both thought they were being clever by getting rid of them, but it backfired. See, Ibrahim was convinced the women were gossiping and plotting against him, but really they were just whispering about how much better life was before Ibrahim took the throne. The thing is, Ibrahim didn't know that. He thought they were scheming, so he ordered them all silk sack him and tossed him in the sea. A small price to pay for paranoia, but his mom wasn't down with that. She pleaded with Ibrahim to let the women come to her and explain their grievances, but he refused. So she went behind his back and then rallied the Janissaries, basically the imperial guard, to depose Ibrahim. lock him up, and strangle him to death in 1648, and thus, one of history's greatest villains got the ending he deserved.